Hello and welcome back to Era 5 of AP US History. In today's video, we'll be looking at topic 5.10, Reconstruction after the Civil War. Now, Reconstruction doesn't refer to the physical rebuilding of the southern states, but rather the political reconstruction of the region. And it happens in several phases, so let's get to it. Lincoln's plan for the political reconstruction of the South began as the Union began to capture significant sections of Confederate territory in late 1862 and 1863. His hope was that these areas could be fully brought back into the Union as quickly as possible. Remember, he felt secession was unconstitutional, and so viewed these states as simply in rebellion and not really having left the Union at all. So his plan to bring back the southern states into the Union was a very lenient one. Southerners, with the exception of high-ranking Confederate officials, could take an oath promising future loyalty to the Union and acceptance of the end of slavery. Once 10% of the number who had been registered to vote in 1860 swore the oath in any one state, a loyal state government could be formed. Before his death, 3 states had met that requirement. Radicals within the Republican Party, led by Thaddeus Stevens, refused to recognize the congressmen sent by those states. Radical Republican objections to Lincoln's plan was primarily that it didn't adequately punish the South for starting and carrying on the war. This represented a growing division within the Republican Party, those who wanted peace at all costs, and those that wanted to inflict punishment on the Confederate rebels. With radicals' growing influence in Congress, they responded by passing the Wade-Davis bill. This proposed law would have removed the administration of Reconstruction from presidential control and put it solely in the hands of Congress. Their plan would have required an oath of loyalty to be sworn by at least 50% of the voting population in a state, again based on the 1860 census. In some areas of the South, due to war-related casualties, this was a number that was impossible to meet unless former slaves were granted the right to vote. Since the bill was passed in the waning days of a legislative term, though, Lincoln refused to sign it, and the bill simply expired, called a pocket veto, which means Congress had no chance to override his veto. Anticipating that the next Congress would probably propose something similar, compromise was definitely going to have to be considered, but Lincoln's assassination ended that possibility. Andrew Johnson, as Lincoln's successor, also proposed a very lenient policy towards the South, although it was more strict than what Lincoln had supported. He disenfranchised all the Confederate officers, people who had served in the Confederate Army, and anyone that had more than $20,000 worth of property in the South, meaning they lost their right to vote unless they were granted a presidential pardon. But in the end, he pardoned most Southern whites, which resulted in a return to power for the same pre-war politicians that had advocated secession in the first place. These Southern politicians then began passing laws that restricted the equality that had been won for former slaves, enacting black codes that sought to maintain white supremacy. Johnson justified his actions because he felt that each state government could best decide how they wanted blacks to be treated. Still, he did eventually include a requirement that states accept the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery, as part of his plan. Many in the North were infuriated that the South would be returning their former Confederate leaders to power. Recently freed blacks found the post-war South very similar to the pre-war South. Remember, though, Johnson had been a Democrat before joining the National Union ticket, and he was from the South. Congress tried to address these civil rights issues with various laws affecting the treatment of former slaves, but was afraid that the courts would declare such efforts unconstitutional, especially since the court was dominated by Southern Democrats. So they worked on passing constitutional amendments to make their laws constitutional. The 13th Amendment, of course, had abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to former slaves and prohibited states from depriving any male citizen of equal protection under the law, regardless of race. And the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to African American males. Eventually, ratification of all of these amendments became a requirement for Southern states to be readmitted into the Union. Although these measures were positive steps towards racial equality, their enforcement proved extremely difficult, and the South frequently found ways around the laws to reestablish a system of white supremacy. Now we have to take a little closer look at the 15th Amendment. While it did extend suffrage to all men regardless of race, it explicitly only extended the right to vote to men. Women's rights advocates like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were angered that it did not recognize the right of women to vote, something they had been working towards for more than a decade. Amongst women's rights advocates, there were significant debates over this amendment, and the movement split into two groups. Stanton and Anthony formed the National Women Suffrage Association, which continued to fight for the franchise to be extended to women. Others, like Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, were disappointed over the 15th Amendment's wording, but argued that it was still important to support Reconstruction efforts at the federal level while continuing to work for women's suffrage on the state level. They formed the American Women's Suffrage Association to work for these goals. Unfortunately, these divisions led to animosities that pitted one social group against another, with white women, African American women, and African American men all in separate camps and rarely cooperating. As a direct result of the denial of the right to vote to women in the case of Minor v. Happersett, the courts found ways in which to limit voting rights for African American men as well, cynically skirting the legislation of the 14th and 15th Amendments with the Jim Crow laws. We'll look at those in a bit. The congressional elections of 1866 ended up being a battle for who would control Reconstruction. Voters were often given a difficult choice: a radical Republican who wanted to punish the South severely, or a Copperhead Democrat who would be incredibly lenient to former Confederates. The strong campaign by the radical Republicans and widely publicized race riots and harsh black codes, and the election of many former Confederates to political office, convinced many who were otherwise undecided to go ahead and vote radical Republican. With the overwhelming congressional win, not even a presidential veto could stop radical control of Reconstruction, since the radical Republicans had overwhelming control of Congress. They wanted to punish the South and to prevent the ruling class from continuing in power. They passed the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts and outlined how the new governments would be designed. Americans had long been suspicious of the federal government playing too large a role in the affairs of states, but the radicals in Congress felt that extraordinary times called for direct intervention in state affairs and laws designed to protect these emancipated blacks. At the heart of their beliefs was the idea that blacks must be given a chance to compete in a free labor economy. Those who had recently been freed received the right to vote and began to hold political offices, positions that formerly belonged to Southern Democrats. In 1866, this activist Congress also introduced a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau and began work on civil rights legislation. But President Johnson stood in opposition. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau bill, claiming it would bloat the size of the government. And he vetoed the Civil Rights Bill, rejecting the idea that blacks had the same rights of property and person as whites. Moderate Republicans were appalled at Johnson's obvious racism. They joined with the radicals to overturn his Civil Rights Act veto. Many in the South were aghast, but they could do little to stop the power of the Congressional Republicans. Then in 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which Edwin Stanton, as Secretary of War, would be charged with enforcing. Johnson opposed this act and tried to remove Stanton, in direct violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which required the approval of the Senate to remove appointed officials. Johnson opposed both laws, feeling that they were a challenge to his presidential authority, so he purposely violated them. Within days, 11 articles of impeachment were drawn up against Johnson. Now remember, impeachment refers to the process specified in the Constitution for the removal from office of any federal official accused of misconduct. It has 2 stages. The House of Representatives charges the official with articles of impeachment. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors are defined as impeachable offenses. Once charged by the House, the case goes before the Senate for a trial. But as with politics, things are rarely simple. Other factors could definitely come into play. And at this point, since there was no vice president, had Johnson been removed from office, his replacement would have been the president pro tem of the Senate, a man named Benjamin Wade, a radical Republican who was unpopular with both moderate Republicans, businessmen, and of course, Democrats. In May of 1868, after a 3-month trial, 35 senators voted to convict Johnson. But that was one vote short of the required 2/3 majority. 10 Republican senators had jumped party lines and found Johnson not guilty. Of course, as had all 9 Democrats. So Johnson was able to serve out his term, but he was very weakened politically. His non-removal may have actually been more of a reflection on Wade's unpopularity than really a decision in his favor. It would be 130 years before another president, Bill Clinton, is impeached. And 1868 was a presidential election year. With no true party support, Johnson was most definitely not going to be renominated. The National Union Republican Party, the Radical Republicans, nominated Ulysses S. Grant for president. The party's platform praised congressional control of Reconstruction and promised payment of the national debt in gold. The Democratic Party, struggling from being associated with the Confederacy, nominated New York Governor Horatio Seymour. The party called for the repayment of national debt in greenbacks or paper money, a move that would appeal to debtor elements such as Eastern workers and Western farmers, who were suffering from a post-war deflation of the currency. Grant was victorious 218 to 80 in the Electoral College, but his popular margin was only about 300,000 votes. His opponents noted that really this wasn't a mandate for radical policy because you had about 700,000 former slaves and former free blacks voting for Grant in this election, claiming that this is why he won the election in the first place. The first 2 years of Congressional Reconstruction saw Southern states rewrite their constitutions, as well as the ratification of the 14th Amendment. Here, Congress seemed fully in control, and only President Johnson had stood in the way, but his impeachment, even though he remained in office, really limited any opposition. Many Southerners, whether white or black, rich or poor, barely recognized the world in which they now lived. Not all Southerners supported the radical Republicans. In fact, many Southern whites really could not accept the idea that former slaves could not only vote, but hold office. Wealthy whites, long accustomed to plush plantation life and the perks of political power, now found themselves barred from voting and barred from holding office. Their estates were in shambles. Many of their former servants didn't want to return to work for them, and poor white farmers now found competition for both jobs and land. But for the slave, Reconstruction was offering a miraculous window of hope. Those who had been born into slavery could now vote. They could own land. In parts of the South, they could ride with whites on trains and eat with them in restaurants. Schools, orphanages, and public relief projects aimed at improving the lives of Black Americans were emerging all over the South. And perhaps most stunning of all, African Americans began holding political office. They were becoming sheriffs and judges. They were elected to school boards and city councils. 16 Black Americans sat in Congress from 1867 to 1877. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first African American senator in 1870. In December of 1872, P.B.S. Pinchback of Louisiana became the first African American elected the governor of a state. All in all, about 600 African Americans served as legislators on a local level. But as the saying goes, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And we'll look at how this political reconstruction failed when we move on to our next topic. Well, that's what you need to know about topic 5.10, the government policies and Reconstruction. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.